Of all the world's continents, Australia may be the smallest, but it's also the only one to be entirely controlled by just a single country. Almost Australia is really empty. And to hammer the point home even further, consider the towns of Esperance on the south coast and Kununurra near to the north coast. Both of these towns are within the same state of Western Australia, and it takes at least 35 hours of time to drive from one to the other across a distance of more than 3,200 kilometers. And along that entire distance in time, you'll maybe only drive through a population of less than 70,000 people the entire way. For comparison, this drive would be about the same time and distance as driving from Madrid to Istanbul across nearly the whole of Europe, where there would be a lot more than 70,000 people. So what is it about Australia that makes it such an overall empty void of people? What is it about this continent that has made everything I just brought up possible? Well, the easy answer that I'm sure most of you are thinking right now is the desert. Duh. Everybody knows that Australia is covered in a big old desert with tons of super dangerous animals and insects. Who would ever want to actually live in most of the country? And while there is some truth to this line of thinking, I am here to argue with you that that's only a small part of the overall population puzzle in Australia, and the full explanation for why there are so few people on this continent is overall a pretty complicated one. Most of the problem stems from the fact that Australia is pretty uniquely cursed when it comes to both the geologic and location perspective. Located relatively close by to Antarctica, the frozen continent, the western side of Australia is continuously battered by cold ocean currents coming up from the Southern Ocean, which means that there simply isn't enough heat to generate large-scale evaporation that's necessary to form rain clouds over much of the west. Meanwhile, in the east, the Great Dividing Range is Australia's largest and longest chain of mountains, and the fifth longest anywhere in the world. These mountains run down the entire eastern side of the continent from north to south, and their height denies many rain clouds advancing from the Pacific the ability to move any further into Australia than the immediate and narrow band of land between the mountains and the coastline. Thus, a so-called rain shadow is cast by these mountains across the vastness of the Australian interior to the west, where moisture coming in from the east understandably struggles to penetrate into. But these mountains, generally speaking from a global perspective, aren't really all that impressive. Truly big mountains cannot be found anywhere on the surface of Australia, and overall, the continent has the lowest average elevation of all of Earth's continents, which just creates a further huge problem for rainfall. The tallest mountain and highest point that can be found anywhere in mainland Australia is here within the Great Dividing Range, Mount Kosciuszko, and it's only 2,228 meters high above sea level. For comparison, the highest point of every single other inhabited continent is at least more than double that height, and nearly 3/4 of the entire US state of Colorado alone maintains an elevation that is significantly higher than just that one sorta tall mountain in Australia. This means that there are simply very few tall mountains to be found anywhere on the continent that are actually capable of forcing air upwards where it's possible to cool into rain. I mean, just take a look at this map of Australia's average rates of annual rainfall, where you can see most of the rain on the continent falls on the east coast in the stretch of land between the coastline and the Great Dividing Range, in the north that stretches into the tropics, Tasmania in the south, and around Perth in the southwest corner. It's basically an identical map with Australia's current population density pattern, except in one very interesting and notable area: Northern Australia. The problem up here is not that it receives a low amount of rain on average, but that it receives that rain largely all at once and over ridiculously variable periods of time. Just like everywhere else in the tropics, Northern Australia is dominated by the wet and the dry season, where rainfall is greater during the summer and less during the winter. In the case of Darwin, the largest city up here on Australia's northern coast, the average annual rainfall amount is more than 1,800 millimeters, which is nearly triple the amount of rainfall that London gets. However, the vast majority of that rain falls during just the 4 months of the wet season between December and March, when the area's monsoons and tropical cyclones are generally active. And when you discount the immediate coastline, the rest of northern Australia in the interior, between the coast in the north and the Tropic of Capricorn in the south, suffers from some of the most highly erratic rainfall seen anywhere on the planet, largely owing to the unpredictable pattern of the area's tropical cyclone. 9 of the 10 hottest recorded years in the continent's history have taken place just since 2005. These higher temperatures are rapidly increasing the rates of evaporation throughout the waters of the basin. It's also the scarcity of good land for farming and agriculture, owing once again largely to geography, geology, and location. In northern Australia, there hasn't been any new mountain building since the Precambrian era that ended 1.5 billion years ago. And even further, there hasn't been any glacial activity here since the Carboniferous ended nearly 300 million years ago. Thus, this entire region that covers nearly half of the continent has suffered its soils being beneath continuous weathering and erosion for well over 250 million years, compared to less than 10,000 years for most of the soils on other continents like North America, Europe, or Asia. Therefore, the soil nearly everywhere in northern Australia just sucks for agriculture. The only exception to that rule is the area of the river basin that drains here into Lake Erie. But this is an overall small amount of the north, and the rainfall required for irrigation here is still very low. In fact, Australia has an estimated 492 cubic kilometers worth of renewable freshwater resources, which is more than a lot of countries with significantly higher populations. That's twice as much as Pakistan, for example, a country which has more than 8 times as many people. So it's not just a sheer lack of fresh water, and it's not just a sheer lack of arable land either. While, yeah, only about 6% of Australia's land is actually arable and suitable for agriculture, Australia is huge. So that 6% is still a ton of usable farmland. To put it in a context, Australia has more arable land than Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos all have combined. Despite all of these countries having a combined population of 542 million people, and Australia only having 26 million people, still substantially less than the population of America, but also substantially more people than Australia has today. In theory, Australia does have enough space and resources to support a lot more people than the 26 million who live there today. The big reason why it doesn't is because for pretty much the entire history of Australia, right up until the present day, it's just been a really tough place for anyone to actually get to. You see, for millions of years now, Australia has been effectively a lost continent, isolated from all the Earth's other major landmasses, drifting alone out in the sea. This has resulted in millions of years of completely separate evolution for the animals of the continent, which is why Australia is unique among Earth's continents for the fact that marsupials, and not placental mammals, dominate the indigenous mammal wildlife species. Modern humans first reached the continent sometime around 50,000 years ago, when the area's geography looked radically different than it does today. The next 9,600 years before the eventual arrival of the Europeans in the 17th century, the Australian continent may have only been significantly visited and impacted by outside humans a total of just 2 times. Dingoes, an invasive species of dog likely originating from New Guinea, were introduced to Australia sometime around 8,300 years ago, potentially by an unknown group of human visitors coming from the island. About 11% of the modern Aboriginal Australian DNA also derives from Indians, which suggests a potential encounter on the continent with a group of humans from South Asia sometime around 4,000 years ago. And then, after millennia of existing almost entirely undisturbed by the outside world, in 1606, a Dutchman and his crew suddenly showed up on their ships and landed right here on the western side of the Cape York Peninsula. But even after that, the Dutch never really bothered to ever establish any permanent settlements or presence on the continent. because the parts of it that they found were generally decided to be too uninhabitable for all the reasons that I mentioned during the first half of this video. The closest the Dutch ever came to a permanent settlement on Australia happened entirely by accident. 50 years after their discovery in 1656, a Dutch ship called the Vergulde Drieck crashed off the coast of Western Australia around here. 75 of the ship's survivors miraculously made it to the shore, and then 7 of them were dispatched on one of the ship's lifeboats to make the 1,400-mile-long journey over to Batavia, or modern-day Jakarta, on the island of Java, which was the administrative capital of colonial Dutch rule in Indonesia at the time. After 41 grueling days of travel, these 7 people finally made it to Batavia and raised the alarm for the 68 crew and passengers who they had left behind back in Australia. And for the next several years, numerous search and rescue missions were carried out by the Dutch Navy all along the Western Australian coast. But little sign of the ship's wreckage was ever discovered, and the 68 survivors of the Vergulde Drieck who were left behind were simply never seen or heard from again. Their ultimate fates remaining a mystery to this day. Well over a century after the vanishing of the Vergulde 68 on the continent, the British finally established the first truly permanent European settlement on Australia only in 1788 over on the complete other side of the continent around modern-day Sydney with around 1,300 people. At the time, the Aboriginal population of the continent was likely only somewhere around 650,000. Which was pretty much the entire population of Australia as a whole. To put that into perspective, every other inhabited continent on the planet had vastly more people than that back in 1788. Asia already had more than 650 million people, around 1,000 times the population of Australia. While Europe had nearly 150 million, Africa had 85 million, and the Americas had around 20 million. Australia therefore began the modern era of industrialization from a far lower population base than any other of Earth's inhabited continents, and since population growth tends to be exponential, Australia has been lagging behind the rest for centuries. In 1788, the population of the freshly independent United States stood at around 4 million people. It would take Australia more than a century of history, not until the year 1906, to finally surpass the population of the United States back in 1788. And by 1906, America's population was already pushing 90 million. For most of Australia's history, immigration came almost entirely from just a single source: the British Isles. Following the discovery of gold on the continent in 1851, a massive gold rush to Australia ensued that saw around 2% of the entire population of the British Isles emigrate to Australia throughout the decade of the 1850s, and more than doubled the Australian population almost overnight. But Australia struggled to attract large numbers of immigrants from Europe afterwards, because it was heavily competing for them with more attractive countries in the Americas like the United States, Canada, Brazil, and Argentina, who were much closer to Europe geographically and were thus generally cheaper and quicker for Europeans to emigrate to. It didn't help that beginning in 1901, the Australian government enacted a policy that would artificially reduce their numbers of immigrants to the continent for decades: the racist White Australia policy, which restricted immigration to only people of white, European ancestry, and initially gave overwhelming preference to migrants coming specifically from Britain. As a result, the flow of immigrants to the continent remained only a trickle of people for decades across the early 20th century, while at the same time, millions of immigrants were arriving in the United States every couple of years. The population of Australia even shrank during World War I, when nearly 1 in 5 of Australia's men were shipped off to fight the war in Europe. Around 2.5% of Australia's entire male population of the time never made it back home from the trenches and beaches of Europe. By the eve of World War II, Australia was a small and overwhelmingly European nation of only around 7 million on the periphery of Asia. And many white Australians of the time were terrified of being demographically overwhelmed by the extremely more populous nations of Asia just to the north. Earth. By the time war came to the continent, Imperial Japan had more than 10 times Australia's population, at more than 73 million. And after the Japanese bombed the northern Australian city of Darwin in 1942, fears across the continent were rife that an imminent Japanese invasion was coming. And while the invasion never actually materialized, the Australian government nonetheless came to believe that they needed to increase their population to avoid the threat of another invasion scare like that again in the future. Before 1945, almost all the immigrants to Australia came from either Great Britain or Ireland. But after the war, Australia for the very first time began encouraging immigration from across the European continent. The policies restricting immigration largely only to Britons were gradually relaxed to be more inclusive of all Europeans, and by the 1960s, 3 million mainland Europeans from places like the Baltic states, Poland, Italy, the Balkans, and Greece packed up their bags and headed to Australia to begin a brand new life, many of them being displaced refugees from the war. But the exclusion of non-whites as immigrants to the continent remained largely in force for several more decades even after the war. It wasn't until 1973, nearly 3 decades after the end of World War II, that the White Australia policy was finally overturned and race ceased being a factor in the continent's immigration policy. Ever since, Australia has maintained an official policy of multiculturalism and has welcomed large-scale, multi-ethnic immigration for decades from all across the world. And now, in the 21st century, the vast majority of new immigrants to the continent come from Asia and not from Europe, especially from China and India. Today, Australia caps the new numbers of immigrants to the continent at less than 200,000 a year, which, for a country of only 26 million, is actually a pretty consistently high rate of immigration. As of 2022, nearly 1 in 3 people on the Australian continent was born outside of it, which is by far the highest proportion of immigrants found in the population of any developed Western nation. Australia today is a proud nation of immigrants from all across the world, and by 2050, the continent's population is projected to increase up to around 36 million. About the same as Canada today, and largely through continued immigration. But the growth over the next 2 decades will not come without its challenges. The continent's ancient natural challenges like unpredictable rainfall, drying rivers, droughts, and vast arid wilderness, along with new challenges like the uncertain course of climate change, mean that Australia has an epic battle against its own environment ahead of it to continue increasing their population. But despite all the odds that are stacked up against them, the country is actually one of the world's most major agricultural producers and exporters. With more than 104 million sheep on the continent, there are 4 times as many sheep as humans, and consequently, Australia is the world's 2nd largest producer of sheep and wool, and the 5th largest producer of beef. In addition, Australia is the home of slightly more than half of all the world's certified organic farmland, and is a global leader in almond and lentils production.